debate amongst yourselves, debate back to the panel, and just give you that chance to share your thoughts. So if you'd like to start.
Hi there. My name's Tariq Hussain, and I also work with secondary school age students and what we might call quite a vulnerable age group as well.
Could you speak up a bit, please?
Oh, sorry. Yes, so I was just saying I also work with young people as well as a teacher, and a lot of them are Muslim. And a lot of the work I've done in the past has been with some of the most, what we would call the most vulnerable and susceptible to the extremist, sorry to use the word, but the extremist ideology. And in the comments that you've made, Rashad, you said, although it's very complex, the common thread is quite clearly this attractive ideology. So if that's the kind of common thread, I mean, we're all having these discussions all the time, and there's lots of these going on. And as I was saying earlier to the people here with me, that often we're kind of talking to the converted. So what kind of work is going on in your experience, because obviously you're in this field, that's actually on the ground and really kind of reaching out to the most vulnerable and to the most susceptible, who, in my experience, do not have the faculties, one of them being critical, to kind of convincingly counteract these narratives that you're talking about, to kind of convincingly denounce them. And earlier, the lady from the kind of humanist perspective said that when she spoke to those 3 students in that university, they were scared to question, inverted commas, scholars, because there's this fear of critically questioning anything that has any kind of Islamic theological underpinning. So where is, in your opinion, and I have my opinion, where is the root of this problem, this inability for young people to kind of question these narratives?
Okay, great. If you could hold yeah, at the back.
Yeah, I'm Dave here, Chris, and I'm a socialist, and so as not a Muslim, I therefore don't have to start by condemning each other. You know, to criticise me first, and not challenge me on that wider basis. You see, the great Algerian revolutionary Frantz Fanon said that when they attack the Jew, they mean you. And he was addressing, just after the Second World, the dominant racism of his time. And I think it is true to say, at the moment, when they attack Islam or when they attack Muslims, they mean you. They mean, it's part of a racist attack that will be generalised and spread. And I think it's a recognition of that fact that really we have to start a lot of discussion from. And so you see, when Rashad says about the reaction from the left, that somehow we'll be patting brown people on the head and saying they're there. But I don't really think that is the case. I think it is a recognition that racism and Islamophobia is one of the main challenges in society today. And we have to start by fighting that, by defending that, by standing together against that. But I'm going to use the I word here now, imperialism. You see, I think it's the one thing that really hasn't been said. And when we talk about a narrative about terrorist extremism and so on, we have to see where is this narrative coming from. You see, I doubt that any young people think that going to Syria and beheading people is how to fight against the invasions in the East. They think they're going to fight is, and therefore they take on the ideas that are necessary to enable them to do that. So I'd see that this question of this response to the bombing, to the invasion of Iran, the invasion of Afghanistan, and so on, as a base on which those ideas can become prevalent. And you see, it comes to the question of Breivik. Because again, why doesn't Breivik appear in the lists of terrorists? Because it doesn't fit the dominant narrative.
Okay.
It doesn't say
Thank you.
into the idea that there is this.
I'm going to move on to other.
This war on terror, and therefore that this is the main thing in society.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think we've just seen a wonderful illustration of the point that Ravan was making earlier on about the importance of distinguishing between attacks on people and attacks on ideas. Because there was an elision there between attacking Muslims and attacking Islam. Now, if you say that attacking Islam is a form of racism, then it immediately means that once you attack Islamism, the sort of issues that we've talked about here, you can immediately be, that challenge can immediately be rejected. And I know that it's happened to me a number of times. I've been accused of being a racist. We must get away from this idea. We must be able to attack ideas and respect people.
Thank you, yeah.
Hi, I'm a local psychiatrist here. I think this isolation is rather self-imposed as well, to a degree. You just can't say that we have, so there is a degree of self-imposition because the way you dress and the way your ideas actually, you can isolate yourself, actually is more common. So one thing, and the other thing is that this notion of that it's only going to be an issue with Muslims, and I think maybe it is, because we don't see the Hinduphobia, Sikhophobia in this country, because by and large they don't make up news which most Muslims do. So we'll have to look at the basic fundamentals, that why this is happening as well, why Muslims see them as under attack all the time. So.
Thank you. Yeah, at the back over there.
So the person who just spoke about how Muslims are mostly talked about, well, Hitler was a Christian fundamentalist. He killed 6 million Jews. So why was Christianity not brought into question? Why is it Islam being brought into question? There's 1.6 billion 6 billion Muslims in the country, in the world. If we were all terrorists, this planet wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be sitting here. You know. So let's move away from having terrorism and Muslim Islam being synonymous. Let's change the vote count.
Any other questions? Yeah, Ken at the back.
Just a word on this isolation phenomenon. I work with a lot of Muslim children in Nottingham. I teach them their own home. I meet the families. And I can understand the motive for a degree of cultural isolation, partly due to the areas in which these people live. They don't live in the best suburban areas. They live in areas where the non-Muslim population often alcohol abuse, drugs, or that is the perception. And I can understand it very well. What I think is a possibility is that well-motivated isolation of the Muslim community in Britain has made the same community vulnerable to harmful influences. So, if you like, people have wandered into a dangerous situation innocently, for the best of motives, for the welfare of their children, in order to preserve their culture, which I think they rightly see, and I say this as a white European, I think they rightly see as superior to the culture of the people around them.
Okay, and
yeah, I wanted to just sort of continue the discussion from the colleague over there, the teacher colleague there, because this might be a purely local experience, although I doubt that. But I've been teaching in the East End now for nearly 10 years, and elsewhere in the inner city before that, and in my particular college for the last nearly 10 years. And I have never known a time in which such a number of young Muslim students are saying we have had enough, and particularly since Charlie Hebdo. And they are in the main, not least, young women Muslim students. And when people talk about the complexity, well, this is true, but I think sometimes the complexity gets turned on its head. In my role, I have to meet individual students facing all sorts of issues and problems at home, in the community and elsewhere all the time. And it is true that amongst them, young women Muslim students facing very oppressive relationships at home or with men they know. However, those same women students, almost to a majority, wear the hijab as an assertion of their identity and are often at the forefront of opposing what they see as placing the community under suspicion, they identify the community on a kind of political, cultural and religious level at the same time that they have these other questions. Then it's not true that the two things separate out. So, but I think we're in a very dangerous situation. So, for example, our college counsellor has said that since Charlie Hebdo, the number of students who are now coming to her who mention in some way or another an experience of Islamophobia has gone up about 7 times. One student told her that she could no longer come to counselling because she feared that the counsellor would have to report her religious views, her devoutness actually, to prevent. Now, the problem is, as teachers, the one guarantee, well, it's not a guarantee, but the only way to minimise the risk of a student thinking that everyone is the enemy is not treating them as the enemy, of ensuring there's freedom of discussion, of ensuring debate. The one thing that quells that is when you make them think that they're under suspicion as a community and that certain views can't be trusted. And I'm afraid this is where I think, I'm sorry, the Prevent agenda falls down. I think it's quite right. It has become a toxic brand in East London. As several students have said to me, it's which side are you on? Are you with us or are you with the terrorists? That's the lesson they said they drew from members of staff who put Je suis Charlie Hebdo on their door. Now, I want to argue with them, some of them, about the framework they adopt. It's not about terrorism, they don't have that, but a kind of, very isolationist framework of just staying together as a community in order to stand up against Islamophobia for civil rights, rather than joining wider, forces. I want to argue with them about that. But if they're not going to actually say what they think, I can't have an argument about it. And I certainly can't take on ideas that everyone thinks us is the enemy, therefore they're the enemy, and then anything goes, and we'll start making excuses for ISIS or whatever. I can't articulate that argument if they're not going to actually say it. And this is, I think, really essential.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to give the panelists a minute to come back, and then we'll go back out to the audience again. So Liz, if you want to.
Well, I just want to thank the teachers in particular for their contributions, because for me, you are in the front line. Sorry, guys and girls, your teachers here. This is what worried me about the case of Ahmed, and which is why I've raised it with Muslim Teachers Association's MUT here, because if we had a Charlie Hebdo situation here, it could happen here, what happened to that 9-year-old child. And I think the critical thing is, I don't disagree with people saying where the isolation comes from. It doesn't matter whether it's coming from the framework, whether it's coming from cultural insularity, whether it's a reaction to the Islamophobia. We've got to stop it. And the most important thing for me is to stop seeing this, to protect children from this us and them debate, and to see children as children, and as children they must be protected. And that's the key thing I think we can start on from today. The second thing I would say about this question, about the examples, the anecdotes which were given about sort of young Muslim children with attitudes towards religion, that they had to accept the authority, etc. I think we're getting to an idea about attitudes which is very technical. People's attitudes change in the course of a struggle, and it's like we've forgotten that. I cut my teeth in struggles in East London around the Newham 7 and Newham 8. The first movement in this country where school children went on strike against racism. And I can tell you, we were having the same discussion then. The girls were not coming forward, the boys were telling them what to do, and all of a sudden, girls were leading the front of the march. It's a part of a collective struggle against something that attitudes change. You can't force attitudes to change.
I fundamentally agree with you. You can't have a conversation with somebody about, or a young child especially, or any student, about issues if they feel there's a climate where they're going to be condemned for holding their views. And that's fundamentally a problem. You actually need to, and I work with quite a few of the schools in East London as well, and one of the issues that we're looking at is being able to create safe spaces for debates and discussions. There are many schools which have created this. They've actually done quite well to separate these areas out, where they're having Muslim teachers often. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but often it is Muslim teachers who have separate areas for discussions where they can come and have those debates and discussions, and I think that is important. Having said that, I think the spectrum of kind of points that have raised do actually raise some of the issues that we're dealing with. So as an example, very simply put, criticizing Islam is not the same as making statements which are discriminatory against Muslims. Fundamentally, that's true. Because if that was the case, every single Muslim would be an Islamophobe. Because every single Muslim criticizes each other's understandings of Islam. You will never find, there's this saying, if you get 2 Jewish rabbis in a room, you'll get 3 opinions. Try that with Muslims. And so actually this notion that we need to remove criticism of Islamic teaching is fundamentally problematic. And that does relate to this issue of critical thinking. I think that is key. And I think it is key actually more generically, not related to this issue, and actually just more generically regarding Islam and Islamic debate and discourse. This is a much wider discussion about to what extent do we have critical thinking. And I would say, look, historically speaking, Muslims have traditionally had critical thinking. They've had a massive diversity of opinion. They've had a and these were major scholars from the traditions and various traditions. I think, and this is my personal observation, it has no foundation or no real evidence base whatsoever, it's just what I feel. I think there's this feeling amongst generally, now when we speak about 1.6 billion Muslims, as I'm competent and qualified to do so, there's a general feeling in the Islamic discourses amongst Muslims, which for whatever reason, they do not feel they can be critical because there's a lack of confidence in their own tradition, where they see themselves in the world. And I think there are broader discussions about that. Historically speaking, I think it was perfectly fine to give an example without hopefully shouldn't be too abstruse. Imam Tahawi was a 2nd century Muslim scholar. His text on Aqidah is considered, or Muslim religious belief, is considered the orthodox text amongst Muslims. Salafis quote it, Sufis quote it, whoever amongst Sunni Muslims is considered orthodoxy. He also wrote a 10-volume book called Mushkilul Athar, the problems with hadith. And he literally gets all these hadith and he problematizes them. There's a hadith which says, Man baddalu dinahu faqtulu. Whoever changes his religion, you should kill him. And he says, whoa, the Quran says, like Rafiddin is a compulsion in religion. The Quran says, some people believe, then they'll apostatize, then they'll believe, then they'll apostatize. This hadith is problematic. And then he goes, so he does that. Why can he do that? Because he's speaking, civilizationally speaking, Muslims were a powerful civilization. Intellectually speaking, they weren't necessarily challenged themselves, but they were the ones doing the challenging. So I think there's a social reality there where they were confident to do so. For whatever reason, Muslims today do not feel that. And therefore there is, I think, your question, I wish I could say to you there were so many things happening, that in the schools there's all these people engaging, there's all this, there isn't. The truth is there's some activities some individuals are doing, but there really isn't the level of discourse that needs to happen.
Can I just come back on that just briefly?
Yeah, you.
I'm good. I was just thinking about some of the other things, but go ahead.
Yeah. So for me, it's going back to what Zia was saying earlier as well. Like we had this tradition of critical thinking, but it never became dominant. And so we have this clear fence. It's almost like you ring fence Islamic theological thinking, whatever you want to call it, in the mind of young people as something you unquestionably have to just accept without questioning. Yet these are the same people, in my experience, students who are then being taught by people like me to critically question, analyse, and assess every aspect of their life. But yet when they confront Islam, they're being told not to. And this seems to be the overarching kind of, whenever I'm having a discussion with young people, this is what I'm getting from them. And I think that discouragement of critically looking at any of the narratives, Islamic ones, whether it's the really dangerous ones or even the ones at home, the kind of everyday ones, the ones that are culturally influenced or whatever else, they're not allowed to question it, and they're almost being told that it's, to use that word, haram to even go in that direction, to question people who have knowledge, to people who have authority and so on. And I think this is where the fundamental issue is. And I think what happens as well is, because Muslims, primarily young Muslims, get 2 forms of education. They get the one that they're getting in school, and most of the time they also get one in the madrasas. So these independent madrasas that are built and developed all over the Western world as well as the Islamic world, and I think that's what happens. The issue that they have with not being able to question critically their own faith is reinforced in the madrasas often. It's consistently reinforced, and there is no presence of the heritage or the tradition of critical thinking in traditional Islamic education.
I think there's
So organisations like this, when I earlier said that, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but organisations like this, when I said earlier that they're doing a great job of trying to encourage critical thinking, I think organisations like this should kind of team up with other organisations and really push this into these madrasas. They should really push this into these madrasas, especially in the West, because I think here we're going to be more willing to accept it.
I'm going to let the audience, and then we'll come back to you, if that's all right. Yeah? Do you want to go? Yeah.
I think we need to come back to context again, because you see, Rashad, you made a very sophisticated argument saying that these are all the different factors involved in what might tip someone over into an act of violent terrorism. Of course, terrorism isn't new, is it? No, it's not. There's no such a thing as, terrorism. Muslims didn't invent terrorism. We had the IRA in France, in Spain, all over Europe for even through, if you start from the Second World War onwards, there's been terroristic acts that have taken place. Yeah. So we have to put it within the context. And I think you're right. I mean, you can't really talk about what's happening at the moment unless you talk about what's happening in the Middle East, and the idea that somehow us in the first world can somehow not be affected by the carnage which is happening in the Middle East. I mean, I saw an unreported world last night about the fight of the Kurds against ISIS. It was horrendous that they're fighting for pieces of ground littered with dead bodies and blown up houses. That's it. That's what's happening there. The idea that the first world can seal it off from that kind of state-sanctioned violence, if you like, somehow it can't happen to us. It's nonsense. It's bound to leak back, isn't it? You can't take again out the social context. Those guys in Paris are part of a generation of Muslims who've been criminalised. 70% of people in French jails are Muslim. In Paris, it's probably around about 85 or 90% of people in French jails are Muslim. That's a whole generation who've been completely alienated from society in the most violent means. Society has done violent things to them. Okay, the problem is you talk a very sophisticated thing. When it comes to the radicalisation agenda, all they want to talk about is the problems within Islam, ideology, and so on and so forth. They take out all the social context. You can't talk about the war on terror. You can't talk about the social conditions of Muslims. All you can talk about is a 6-year-old child who said, which is something I was told, a 6-year-old child said to the teacher, "Oh, it doesn't matter who he was having an argument with. It doesn't matter because you're not Muslim, so you're going to die anyway." Then that phrase gets discussed at the Home Office level by Charles Farr, and what are we going to do about this? The whole family then gets put through the Channel programme of de-radicalisation, which is, of course, only the mirror image of radicalisation. In other words, it's brainwashing, but someone else is doing it. You can't talk, the whole radicalisation agenda, the problem with it is, it's spreading across the whole of our society. The whole of our society, not just Muslims, the whole of our society have been chipped away. Our civil liberties and so on, we've been spied upon in all sorts of different ways. This has been allowed to happen. But we're not allowed to say why all these things are happening. So we can't say why it's happening, then of course it must be Muslims, it must be Islam, it must be something in our religion, specifically in our religion, which is to blame. So when you decontextualise it, so you can contextualise it, right? I agree with a lot of what you say, but actually the majority of the purveyors of Prevent, the witchfinder generals, they're not as sophisticated as you, to be honest.
Just a counter kind of thing. About 3-4 months ago, a young American in a school took a gun and killed about a dozen Muslims. Now, if he had killed if it was a Muslim guy who killed a dozen Americans, the BBC and ITN will be kind of reporting it, live, 24 hours, 36 hours. The Guardian will carry a front page story, but it only appeared in the Guardian page 4 one little comment. Because there's a movement in America now why this massacre has not been reported, right? Because people who were massacred were Muslims. So there is kind of sense of injustice, disproportion going on, and it's a kind of dominant theme in a sense. And I think the fact that we are in 24-hour media and Twitter and all that means that a lot of these things get multiplied, and then we just kind of in a sense get overwhelmed by them. And the overwhelming kind of feeling at the moment is the Muslims who are out there, out to get us, and everywhere we need to look at them with suspicion and what have you.
Yeah, at the back.
And I just want to sort of share an anecdote as well. This week, when the tragedy of the plane crash in France happened, within hours of the suspicion falling on the co-pilot, there was rumours around on social media that he was Muslim and this was his real name, etc. And the reason I know about that is because of my colleagues who look at Twitter were discussing it at work and giving each other this knowing look, that yeah, it's probably right.
Thanks. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Here.
Yeah, I just want to compliment Zia's point around this incident in the US, and I think in discussion around freedom of expression needs to be complemented by the right to information. Now, about 2 weeks back, there was this news that came up in social media about this woman in the US who was suing Abercrombie and Fitch because of the hijab. Now, you can have whatever point of view you might have on that. But I think what I found interesting was my sister in Sweden. She sent a blog by this lady who had written a blog that Abercrombie and Fitch have been sued about 11 times in the last year by women for discrimination in the workforce, but that never really made the story. And somehow this came to a point around the whole hijab issue. So the point, what Zia was saying, that this whole point around, I think the right to information should also be discussed in the context of freedom of expression.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? If you put your hands up. Okay. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about France and the figures you just quoted in France, but in the UK, there's an ever-growing population of prisoners, Muslim, 30%. In
17%.
70%. In Britain.
17.
Britain.
Yeah.
And in Britain, right now, in the middle of elections, the only party that's come out with a comprehensive plan to tackle extremism has been Theresa May's statement a week or so ago. The other parties have not really tackled it. But both of you are in that field. You must have listened to that in detail of the whole long set of plans that they have to do. What's your views in terms of whether that will achieve some sort of de-radicalization in Britain? Do you think such plans are workable in terms of within your field?
Okay, so that's going to be our last question. So I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds. So I'm going to start.
Okay. It seems I'm giving it 30 seconds. No. And there's lots of reasons why. I was just going to say, look, the complexities involved in some of these things are important. The reason they're important because if you misunderstand them, you will disproportionately focus on one or the other issues. And this is why people may disproportionately focus on ideology, or they may disproportionately focus on other factors. Coming back, yes, free speech is an issue, and yes, people may feel fear for expressing their opinions, but the opposite is also true. It is still the case that, as an example, and again, anecdotally, since we're sharing anecdotes, there's a great recording you can hear Asim Qureshi of Cage going to Queen Mary's University, telling people that do not criticize people that do suicide bombings in Moscow and kill women and children because their scholars have told them this is perfectly fine. So he has the free speech to be able to do this, whilst at the same time speaking about how he's condemned, oppressed, and all this stuff. So that we need to have a little bit of introspection about really contextualizing these things. The prisoners point is really, really key. 17%, the disproportionate number of Muslim prisoners, I think it's about 5 times as many as the actual ratio. Those social issues are still fundamental to be looked at, but I personally believe, and the same with France, it must be separated from the discussion on radicalization and terrorism. Because the issues are so large in themselves, they have to be tackled in themselves as separate pointers. They cannot
Yes,
be.
but if you
I've only got
sign
30
them
seconds.
off-
I've only got 30 seconds.
If you sign them off, it's just about us.
No, they need to be looked at as issues in themselves, which are much bigger and not looked at as security lens.
That's the proper.
And that's
You mean
that's the real
as theological issues?
No, I'm on about the issue of Muslim prisoners, or the disproportionate number of prisoners who come from North African, tend to be Muslim backgrounds within France, as an example. It's a huge social issue. It shouldn't be only looked at through the security lens, and I think doing so is problematic. So, which is why I actually think separating the discussions are important from my perspective. The last thing I was going to say is the media aspect. Yes, the media is horrific about some of this often, and the worst thing for me was the portrayal of the girls that left from East London. You know, if we had any other situation, 14, 15, 16-year-old girls who quite literally were presented as their jihadi brides, I mean, for the love of God, we don't call 14, 15-year-old girls wives. You know, let's just step back for a second. You know, we don't, maybe in Yemen they may do, but we don't do that. We've fundamentally decided that actually this is exploitation, it's grooming, and a lot of it is sexually in nature as well as all the other religious aspects and the cause and so on. So I think some of the media discussion about this was quite horrific. Having said that, as the last point, the media is still the same media. On the one hand, The Guardian, you mentioned, will put on page 4, The Guardian will still publish stuff. As an example, Uthman Badr of Hizb ut-Tahrir will write a piece saying, Hizb ut-Tahrir, really, we're just speaking out against tyranny and oppression. You know, why are you trying to ban us in Australia? And The Guardian will publish that piece without any critical insight to say, actually, hold on a second, no, it's not quite the case. You do believe hijacking Israeli planes is fine. You do believe killing Jews in Israel is perfectly fine. You do believe that democracy is alien, women should be subjugated, homosexuals should be killed, and non-Muslims do not have any political suffrage. So those kind of things, that's probably why people don't like you. And this is my other point regarding the Islamophobia discussion. You can't do anti-Islamophobia activity whilst doing that with a cleric, and who we should be challenging, who Abu Isa Ni'matullah, as an example, is going around doing these anti-Islamophobia events with men. This is a guy who believes women should not be outside in the public sphere because working is haram, and it's just horrible, there's no way around this, and I don't care, and I'm going to stand by this. That's his view. Where do you think people get the view that Islam oppresses women from? If you're going to do that in that way, it's insane. That's not the only reason, and I think the last point I want to really emphasise is the point that you made regarding Pegida. Fundamentally, Pegida is a racist, fascist group. Their agenda, the anti refugee agenda is that is the basis of it. Islamophobia is an add-on. It's an add-on to their agenda because they see it as a respectable form of an acceptable way of criticising minorities. And I think that does need to be tackled in its own.
Wow, that was a long 30 seconds.
Sorry.
Yes, but it was very interesting. Quick point on the prisons. I heard on a radio interview the other day that 1 in 5 high security prisoners is Muslim. And there is a phrase that comes out of struggle called, if they come for you in the morning, they will come for you at night. And what we're seeing happening now is that because of the whole way that terrorism is discussed, that the Muslim prisoners are being used as the excuse to introduce extraordinary prison regimes throughout Europe. So we're getting the supermax and the solidarity confinement coming from US. So we need to be mindful of that. I think it's been a really good discussion, and I felt that we're all agreed. If there's one thing we're all agreed on, is that the whole us and them discourse is unhelpful. But I would like to suggest that we should go a bit further and say that the either or discourse is unhelpful as well. We're not fools. We can fight on many fronts at the same time. So we can fight the racism in the media frameworks. We can fight the monocultural tunnel vision of prevent. But we can also say that we want to protect young children from harmful ideologies or a feeling that they cannot dissent from orthodoxies. But I would suggest in doing this, we have to actually be mindful of what secularism is. I think I'm a humanist, maybe a different sort of humanist, but I am a humanist as well. And I'm a secularist, but secularism for me, my understanding of secularism is that the state upholds the religious rights, the civil rights of all religions, but it does not interfere in religion. And it seems to me that as a humanist, I can't tell the Muslim community how to challenge orthodoxies. I don't think that makes me a left-wing racist. I think it makes me a secularist. So the answer to fighting on many fronts is partnership and respect.
Thank you very much.